divine providence. Divine providence. That idea that God not only is aware of all the evil, the sin, the harsh cruelty of this world, but that he is in some way engaged with it such that he is taking even those things and shaping them for his own purposes. Or do you experience so much upheaval and uncertainty in your life? Have you had so many losses and disappointments that you've decided either there is no God or that his power is greatly limited? Or like the deists, that he created the clock, called the world, wound it up, and walked away. This morning's lesson from Genesis is a powerful proclamation of God's providential grace, a perfect ending to the story of the creation and the fall. Now, we all know the story of Joseph, right? We learned that in Sunday school. Joseph and his coat of many colors. You remember how he had a special place in the heart of his father, Jacob, and how his brothers were jealous of that relationship and how they plotted to kill him. But instead, they had this opportunity to make some money and get rid of him at the same time. So this traveling band of Ishmaelites were coming along, and they decided to sell their brother to the Ishmaelites as they were headed down to Egypt, and he could be sold into slavery. Can you imagine? Joseph was just 17 years old and crying when he realized what they were about to do, begging for mercy, and they showed none. They sold him off, and then they convinced their old daddy that he'd been killed by some wild beast. You remember that when they got to Egypt, he was sold to this fellow named Potiphar, who was the captain of Pharaoh's guard, and that Potiphar's wife thought Joseph was really cute. She made advances toward him, and he being a godly young man, rebuffed those advances, and because of that, she was insulted, and then she said he was trying to take advantage of me. And he was thrown in jail. And you'll remember that while he was in jail, he met Pharaoh's baker and his cupbearer. You remember that he interpreted their dreams, and later that led to the opportunity for him to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh, but that he had to wait for 13 years to get to that point. For 13 years, he lived in misery under the power of these foreign people in this foreign prison. But when finally he had that opportunity to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, what happened? He was immediately elevated to this level of prime minister of Egypt. He was put in charge of all the food, all the grain, and so he spent years trying to store up grain because he knew a famine was coming. God had given him that vision. And then the famine came, and thousands of people poured into Egypt, starving, hungry, in need of help. Joseph was 30 years old when his starving brothers traveled from Canaan to Egypt, desperate for food. And you'll remember, as was read, Joseph showed them mercy and love, sustaining their lives and restoring the family. But most importantly, as a summation of the Joseph narrative, and the whole book of Genesis, Joseph says to his brothers, what you did for evil, God used for good. Is that not a rhapsodic culmination for the fall of Adam and Eve, for Noah and the flood, and the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, all coming together in Joseph's proclamation of faith? What you did for evil, God has used for good. God working through all the sin and deceit and manipulation of humanity to see to it that his larger purposes continue to move forward. As an old preacher once pointed out, if Joseph's brothers had not sold him into slavery, he would not have gone to Egypt. If he hadn't gone to Egypt, he wouldn't have been sold to Potiphar. If he hadn't been sold to Potiphar, Potiphar's wife would not have made advances against him and had him sent to prison. If he'd not been sent to prison, he would not have interpreted the dreams of the baker and the cupbearer. If he'd not interpreted the dreams of the baker and the cupbearer, he would not have interpreted Pharaoh's dreams. If he had not interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, he would not have been made prime minister and allowed to store grain in preparation for the famine. And if he had not stored that grain, his brothers would not have made their desperate trek to Egypt. And if they'd not made their desperate trek to Egypt, they would have suffered and died in Canaan, and the tribes of Israel would not have been God's vessel for Messiah. Wow. All from that one decision. Let's sell this rotten kid into slavery. Now, this is not to say that God caused that sequence of events, that he manipulated them with his power. It means that God worked his providential purposes even through the fallen frailty and the many wrong choices of his people. It's what's sometimes called God's circumstantial will. God working through the circumstances of our lives, through the bad choices, the wrong turns, the mistakes, the blindness, to bring about his providential will, his loving intention for our individual lives and for the life that is to come. I remember when I was at St. John's Church and felt led by God to create St. Peter's almost 20 years ago, how frighteningly uncertain I felt about that whole thing. Not uncertain about God, but very uncertain about my future and the future of this church I was seeking to create. I had no idea we'd end up building a cathedral. I've thought on several occasions, God, if you had been able to just show me the cathedral before I had to step out, the stepping out would have been so much easier. But then there would have been no faith involved, right? No trust. Look at Joseph. Do you think for a moment that when his brothers sold him into slavery, he thought, hot dog, now I'm going to go to Egypt and get to be the prime minister? No, of course not. When he was thrown into the Egyptian prison, when he suffered under Egyptian power for 13 long years, do you think he was thinking, you know what, this isn't such a bad thing because I know I'm going to end up in a great place of leadership and luxury? No, of course not. Yet in the midst of those 13 miserable years, he never gave up on God, and God never gave up on him. We see from the prison narrative in Genesis that he continued to trust in God's love and strength and to persevere, believing that God was with him and continued to care about him no matter what happened. Do you have moments in your life when you feel that everything has fallen apart? When you feel like you've hit a brick wall? That you're living through the dark night of the soul that seems to be never ending? When you can't see God's hand and you're thinking, Lord, I'm praying and praying and praying. What are you doing? I see nothing. You're doing nothing. Where are you? Why aren't you helping? Ever have those experiences? I certainly have. What did Joseph do in the midst of that kind of experience? He chose to trust God. I think it was that simple. Based on his life of faith, based on his belief in who God is and what God is capable of doing, he simply chose to trust. Even when it seemed like things would never get better, he chose to trust. In the midst of that trust, there were moments of light and hope. There were moments when he was in that prison of feeling God's presence, of seeing God work in small ways, which gave Joseph the ability to persevere. Joseph was faithful. And yet we have something that Joseph didn't have that ought to give us a greater opportunity for faithfulness. Christ. We have his teachings. We have the example of his life. We see how he trusted God. We see his suffering, and we see his resurrection. St. Paul tells us, in all things God works together for good, for those called according to his purpose. For those of us who trust that God has a purpose, and that it's a good purpose, and that he's working it out, even when we can't see it. It's like that analogy I'm sure you've heard of the dear lady who embroidered this beautiful bookmark. And on the back side of the bookmark, it's just a mess of string going this way and that way. It just looks like chaos. But then you flip it over, and there are these beautifully sewn words, Jesus is Lord. And sometimes our lives can look like a disordered mess. And it's often that only later, beyond the current chaos, that we look back and see that Jesus was Lord, that he was there with us in the midst of it all the while, working out the purposes of God. Faith is the answer. Joseph had such a deep faith in God's providential love and care that at every turn he continued to hope and to wait and to act as the person God created him to be, to give himself in the fullest way, even when things seemed hopeless and unfair. In other words, you know what he did? He allowed God to use for good those things that were done for evil. You know, we have free will. God allows us the choice. We can choose or not choose. Joseph chose to allow God to use the things for good that had been intended for evil. Did you notice that Joseph could have gone the other direction, but he didn't? He did not nurture within his own heart anger and hate. He could have spent those 13 years feeding the fire of his hurt and loss, growing day by day in a deep hatred of his brothers for what they'd done, and a hatred for the Egyptians because of the way they mistreated him early on. He could have let that build up, just waiting for the day that he could have revenge. But that's not what he chose to do. We see instead that even in prison, he was kind and cooperative with the prison guards, with other prisoners. Even in his darkest days, he was giving hope and encouragement to these other prisoners. We see him doing in prison the kind of thing we see later with the Apostle Paul. You remember? Paul, even in prison, what is he doing? Singing praises to God, ministering to the prisoners and to the guards. But we also see that when the day finally came that Joseph is confronted with those hateful brothers, these young men who had closed their ears to his cries for mercy when he was 17 years old, who had heartlessly sold him as a slave and regarded him as dead, when he came face to face with them, rather than seek revenge or express hatred or bitterness, he chose to show them a mercy that they had not shown him, to offer them forgiveness and love that allowed for restoration. When the brothers realized that the prime minister who had the power to take their lives if he so chose was their brother, they were absolutely terrified because they assumed he was going to take bloody revenge. It's what they would have done if they'd been in his place. But Joseph said to them, "Do I stand in the place of God?" He said, "I'm not your judge. God is your judge." Now, Joseph did not romanticize their deeds. He didn't just sweep it under the rug. He acknowledged that what they had done all those years ago was evil, but that God had even used their evil for his good purposes. Not that God caused their actions or sought out evil as the primary way of his acting in the world, but that in spite of the evil, he used the consequences of that evil to continue moving forward with his loving purposes. What do we typically do? If you're like me, we want revenge. We say we want justice. We want to make them pay for what they've done. We want to see them suffer as we've suffered. But that's not the way of Joseph, and it's certainly not the way of Jesus. I wonder if it isn't the case that we have trouble forgiving people, letting go of our desire for revenge, because we do not really trust God's providential will. Surely, if we trusted that God can take the worst circumstances, the most hateful actions, and use them to shape us in his own good purposes, if I really believe that God has an overarching plan, bigger and more important than anything I've suffered, and that he will gather up my suffering and all those who caused it and all the other broken pieces of my life and use it for good, if I believe that nothing can thwart God's purpose and plan, if I believe all those things, then surely that gives me a freedom to let go, to forgive, to move on with life, giving myself not to the negativity of revenge and hatred, but to the joy and the love and all the good things that God is still seeking to accomplish in my life. Isn't that the heart of the biblical story? With Pharaoh and the Exodus, God using bad things for good purposes. With David and his behavior with Bathsheba and how that was pivotal in God's shaping of David. In Rehoboam, you remember the king after Solomon, who because of his youthful arrogance divided the kingdom of Israel, and how God used that to begin shaping a remnant. The horrible business of Nebuchadnezzar destroying Jerusalem and carting off all these Judahites for 50 years in exile, and how God used that to lay the foundation for the Messiah. All the way through Scripture, all the way down to the evil treatment of Jesus himself, the way he was rejected and crucified, and how God used even that as the very culmination of his good purposes in restoring creation. And what if we brought it further down, even into our lives today? I could bring it forward by telling you that 30 years ago, Mary Pat Moore was the senior warden at St. John's Church when they were trying to choose a new priest. They had gotten down to two possibilities, myself and an older priest from North Carolina. At a late night meeting, they went back and forth through all the pros and cons and decided that they wanted to go with the older, more experienced priest. Mary Pat was driving home about 11 p.m. down an empty Mahan Drive toward Lafayette Oaks, which is where she lived at that time. Said she was restless, felt unsettled, that they'd made the wrong decision and for the wrong reason. She said a car pulled in front of her and stopped at the stoplight, and she pulled up behind it, and there was a bumper sticker that said, "God allows for U-turns." And she took that as a sign, and she turned the car around, and she went back to the chair of the committee's house and told him they'd made the wrong decision. They needed to meet again. And they met again, and they changed their minds. If Mary Pat had not done that, I would never have come to St. John's. It would not have been renovated in the way that it was at that time. The new organ, the bookstore, the cafe. If she had not done what she did, there'd be no St. Peter's, not an old St. Peter's or a new St. Peter's. If she hadn't done what she did, there'd be no Christ Church sitting here on the corner of Thomasville Road and South Ride. It's so interesting to see how much our decisions can matter. How God can work through one simple U-turn and all the ups and downs that came thereafter for his many good purposes. God's providential grace, always providing for his people when they trust his goodness, always sustaining, restoring, using even the terrible hardships and losses of this fallen world to bring about his mercy, his grace, and his love.